For decades, Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late-night television, known for his quick wit, charm, and effortless ability to make anyone feel at ease. But there was one guest who pushed Johnny further than anyone else: Tiny Tim. Beneath Tiny Tim's high-pitched voice and unconventional persona was someone Carson simply couldn't stand. So what really made Johnny so frustrated about Tiny Tim, and why was he banned from attending The Tonight Show? Join us as we uncover the hidden details behind this shocking mystery. Tiny Tim wasn't just a stage name, it was a full-fledged identity, a mask that allowed Herbert Carey to embrace his quirks and transform into a performer unlike any other. While the music scene of the 1960s was pulsing with rock, folk, and psychedelic sounds, Tiny Tim carved out his own lane. He wasn't shaped by the era, he defied it. With his falsetto voice and ukulele in hand, he revived the charm of early 20th century vaudeville and Tin Pan Alley tunes, dragging them into the modern age. But before he became the unforgettable Tiny Tim, Herbert cycled through a string of stage names: Larry Love, Texarkana Tex, and Judas K. Foxglove, each one revealing a different sliver of his artistic soul. Yet, none of them felt quite right. It wasn't until 1963, when his manager, George King, suggested the name Tiny Tim, that everything clicked. With that moniker, Herbert's eccentric persona finally found its perfect match. The name Tiny Tim was deliberately ironic. Herbert stood at 6 feet 1 inch, tall and spindly, the polar opposite of tiny. It was a nod to the frail, sickly character from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, perfectly capturing the essence of a fragile, peculiar, and old-fashioned performer. With that fittingly whimsical name, Tiny Tim was born, not just as a stage persona, but as a fully realized character. More than a musician, Tiny Tim was a living time capsule, channeling the music, mannerisms, and charm of a bygone era. He spoke with exaggerated politeness, almost cartoonishly so, frequently saying, "God bless you, dear," and "Isn't that wonderful?" His voice was as unpredictable as his persona, flipping from a deep, velvety baritone to a trembling, childlike falsetto without warning. And then there was his signature laugh, high-pitched, fluttery, and brimming with nervous joy, an unforgettable part of his act that made him even more endearing and strange. Tiny Tim didn't just perform vintage music, he embodied it. His wardrobe was a deliberate throwback, ill-fitting suits in clashing colors and mismatched patterns, giving him a slightly disheveled, almost clownish charm. His long, curly hair and ghostly pale makeup added to his ethereal, otherworldly appearance. And no matter where he went, his ukulele was always in hand, clutched to his chest like a sacred artifact. He wasn't simply dressed for a performance, he was the performance. A walking spectacle who seemed to have wandered out of a black-and-white film and into the modern day. But it wasn't just his appearance that made him unforgettable. It was his music. Tiny Tim didn't chase trends or write new material. Instead, he breathed life into nearly forgotten relics from the early 1900s, reviving vaudeville ditties, Tin Pan Alley gems, and novelty tunes from the Roaring '20s and the Depression-era '30s. His performances were a curious blend of comedy, nostalgia, and genuine reverence for the past, making him both a charming oddity and a musical time traveler. Tiny Tim's falsetto became his unmistakable trademark. While most male singers aimed for bold, resonant vocals, he defied expectations with a trembling, delicate tone that felt both haunting and oddly tender. His voice seemed to teeter on the edge of breaking, creating a sound that was strangely beautiful in its fragility. Paired with his ukulele, a small, whimsical instrument, the contrast was striking. The playful strums added a lighthearted sweetness that made his dramatic vocal delivery even more captivating. By the early 1960s, Tiny Tim had become a cult icon in Greenwich Village, New York City's epicenter for counterculture, folk, and underground art. He found a regular gig at Page 3, a tiny club where he performed marathon 6-hour sets for a mere $96 a month. Yet, unlike the politically charged folk singers dominating the scene, Tiny Tim was a complete anomaly. He wasn't rebellious or provocative. He was a walking daydream, nostalgic and unapologetically eccentric, making him stand out in a sea of revolutionaries. Tiny Tim quickly amassed a small but fiercely devoted group of fans, drawn in by his bizarre and mesmerizing performances. Some laughed, convinced his act was an elaborate joke, a piece of performance art meant to parody old-timey musicians. But others saw something more. An outsider artist with a genuine passion for resurrecting a forgotten chapter of American music. To them, Tiny Tim wasn't mocking the past. He was preserving it. His big break came in the mid-1960s when he started landing television appearances. His first major spotlight was on a local New York talk show, where he left viewers stunned. With his peculiar appearance, trembling falsetto, and encyclopedic knowledge of obscure music, he was both captivating and confusing. Some assumed he was a comedian playing a ridiculous character. Others were convinced he was the real deal, a sincere performer who had somehow wandered into the wrong century, bringing the sounds of a lost era with him. Tiny Tim quickly became a sought-after guest on variety shows, captivating audiences with his peculiar charm. Hosts and producers were baffled. They couldn't decide if he was a joke, a genius, or something in between. But one thing was certain, viewers couldn't take their eyes off him. His childlike politeness and almost bashful innocence made him seem sweetly naive. Yet, beneath the surface, his performances carried a strange intensity that left people wondering, was this all an act? Or was Tiny Tim simply being his true, unfiltered self? By the mid-1960s, he had cemented his place as a beloved underground oddity in New York's Greenwich Village. While folk legends like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Simon and Garfunkel were rising to mainstream fame, Tiny Tim stood in stark contrast. His music, voice, and entire persona felt as though they had been plucked from a dusty, forgotten time capsule, a performer seemingly untouched by the modern world. Although Tiny Tim had cultivated a small cult following through club gigs and local TV spots, he was still far from being a household name. But that was about to change, dramatically. Seemingly overnight, Tiny Tim was in demand everywhere. Television hosts couldn't quite figure him out. Was he a genuine musician, a quirky novelty act, or an unintentional comedian? It didn't matter. Audiences were hooked. They couldn't get enough of his oddball charm, making him a must-see attraction. His big breakthrough came on April 4, 1968, when he made his first appearance on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Known for his sharp wit and quick sarcasm, Carson was a master at poking fun at even the most serious guests. Yet, when Tiny Tim took the stage, the host was more than just amused. He was genuinely fascinated by the eccentric performer before him. Carson wasn't always sure what to make of Tiny Tim, but he knew one thing for certain. The man was pure TV gold. He was bizarre, unexpectedly funny, and, most importantly, impossible to look away from. Whether viewers were mesmerized, amused, or just plain confused, they kept tuning in. Tiny Tim's regular appearances on The Tonight Show catapulted him into pop culture stardom. Soon, he was selling out concerts, landing on magazine covers, and catching the attention of major record labels. His peculiar charm had officially gone mainstream. In 1968, he signed a recording contract with Reprise Records, the label founded by none other than Frank Sinatra. His debut album, God Bless Tiny Tim, was produced by Richard Perry, a rising star in the industry. Perry would go on to collaborate with major artists like Carly Simon and Ringo Starr, but at the time, he saw something special in Tiny Tim's offbeat magic. Critics were sharply divided. Some dismissed Tiny Tim as nothing more than a gimmick, a comedian in disguise, using music as part of the punchline. But others saw something far more compelling. They recognized the subtle artistry in his song selections, the deliberate theatricality of his vocal delivery, and the genuine reverence he had for the music of a forgotten era. By the end of 1968, Tiny Tim was no longer just an eccentric cult figure. He was a full-fledged national celebrity. His concerts sold out almost instantly, his face graced magazine covers, and he was recognized everywhere he went. Somehow, this once obscure performer from Greenwich Village had become one of the most talked-about entertainers in America. Then, in 1969, he made an announcement that stunned the nation. He was getting married, and it wouldn't be a quiet, private affair. No, Tiny Tim's wedding was destined to be a spectacle like no other. Just as Tiny Tim's career had skyrocketed in the most unexpected way, his personal life was about to take an equally astonishing turn, one that would go down as one of the strangest moments in television history. Tiny Tim had always portrayed himself as an old-fashioned romantic. In interviews, he often spoke with heartfelt reverence about women, fondly calling them angels, and sharing his dream of finding the perfect bride. His chivalrous, almost fairy tale-like musings made him seem sweetly out of step with the modern world. Then, in mid-1969, fate intervened. While signing autographs at Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, he met Victoria May Budinger, a 17-year-old fan. Tiny Tim, who was 37 at the time, was instantly enchanted. Their whirlwind romance became a media sensation, with Tiny Tim frequently gushing about Miss Vicky in interviews, praising her beauty, sweetness, and angelic charm. Despite only knowing each other for 3 months, Tiny Tim proposed to Miss Vicky. Their sudden engagement instantly became a media circus, with reporters eagerly tracking every detail of their whirlwind romance. Tiny Tim's old-fashioned, courtly persona, combined with his offbeat celebrity status, made the announcement front-page news. By this time, Tiny Tim was a regular fixture on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. His peculiar charm and unwavering politeness made him one of Carson's most memorable guests. The host, famous for turning even the oddest moments into entertainment gold, frequently played along with Tiny Tim's eccentricities, delighting viewers. So, when Tiny Tim casually announced his engagement during one of his appearances, Carson half-jokingly suggested they should televise the wedding. Without hesitation, Tiny Tim agreed. What started as a playful remark quickly snowballed into reality, a live, televised wedding event unlike anything audiences had seen before. Oh, and in true Tiny Tim fashion, despite the fame, chaos, and growing spectacle, he remained true to his values. He didn't drink alcohol. The audience, both in the studio and watching from home, was spellbound. To some, it was a charming, old-fashioned love story come to life. To others, it felt like a surreal publicity stunt, an extension of Tiny Tim's eccentric persona. Either way, people couldn't look away. On the surface, it seemed like a fairy tale wedding, but behind the cameras, the foundation of Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky's relationship was already starting to crack. Tiny Tim's views on relationships were a curious contradiction. He often spoke of purity, proudly claiming that he had remained celibate before marriage. He openly idealized women, speaking of them as angelic and flawless beings. Yet, beneath his romantic musings, he wrestled with a restless heart. Despite his longing for devotion, he was equally infatuated with the thrill of pursuing new love interests, an internal conflict that would soon put a strain on his marriage. Tiny Tim's private diary entries reveal a troubling truth. He had doubts even before the wedding. He questioned whether he truly loved Miss Vicky or if he had simply been swept up in the whirlwind of attention and excitement. But this uncertainty wasn't new. Even during their engagement, Tiny Tim struggled with commitment. At one point, he nearly left Miss Vicky for another woman, a fan named Miss Iris. He later confessed that the only reason he stayed was because he couldn't bear the thought of breaking Miss Vicky's heart. Unsurprisingly, their marriage began to unravel almost immediately. Tiny Tim's soaring fame and Miss Vicky's youth created a growing divide. At just 17, she had dreamed of a traditional, affectionate marriage. But Tiny Tim remained devoted to his career and eccentric personal routines, often prioritizing his performances and public persona over their relationship. The gap between their expectations quickly widened, leaving their fairy tale romance in jeopardy. Legally, Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky remained married for 8 years, but in reality, their relationship barely lasted 2. They separated within 2 years of their highly publicized wedding, and in 1977, Miss Vicky officially filed for divorce, bringing their brief and turbulent marriage to an end. Ironically, what was meant to be the most joyful event of Tiny Tim's life also became a turning point in his career, and not for the better. The televised wedding that had drawn millions of viewers ultimately branded him as more of a novelty act than a serious musician. In the aftermath, the offers began to dry up. Major TV shows, once eager to feature him, gradually stopped calling. His record sales slumped, and by the early 1970s, the man who had once been America's most peculiar sensation was slowly fading from the spotlight. After reaching the height of his fame in the late 1960s, Tiny Tim's career took a sharp and unforgiving nosedive in the 1970s. The very quirks that had once made him a television sensation, his trembling falsetto, vintage music style, and eccentric persona, were now working against him. What was once charmingly odd had started to feel outdated. While the entertainment industry is infamous for its rapid rises and falls, Tiny Tim's decline was especially brutal. He faced commercial flops, mounting public ridicule, and deteriorating health. Yet, despite the growing hardships, he stubbornly refused to alter his act or abandon his passion for performing, even as his situation grew increasingly bleak. By the early 1970s, the music landscape had shifted dramatically. The counterculture movement had evolved, and audiences were flocking to new sounds: hard rock, disco, and progressive rock. With acts like Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and Elton John dominating the charts, Tiny Tim's old-timey melodies and vaudeville charm felt more and more like relics from a distant past. This marked a definitive turning point in Tiny Tim's career. Without a record deal, he struggled to maintain the level of fame he had enjoyed just a few years earlier. His once frequent appearances on major television shows also became increasingly rare. Even The Tonight Show, where he had once been a regular guest, began booking him less often. Johnny Carson and other hosts sensed that the public's fascination with Tiny Tim was fading. Without a steady stream of income from record sales or TV gigs, he found it harder and harder to sustain his lifestyle. In a desperate attempt to revive his career, he branched out into unconventional business ventures. One of his most peculiar efforts was a health drink made from honey and vinegar, which he passionately believed was a miracle cure. But the public wasn't buying it, literally. The drink flopped, and his foray into the wellness market ended in yet another disappointment. In the late 1960s, the media had embraced Tiny Tim as a quirky but endearing oddball. However, as his fame faded, the tone of coverage grew noticeably harsher. Once celebrated for his eccentric charm, he was now increasingly portrayed as a washed-up novelty act, a relic of a fleeting pop culture craze. Tiny Tim's personal life was just as unstable as his career. His marriage to Miss Vicky had unraveled almost immediately after their highly publicized 1969 wedding. Although they remained legally married until 1977, they had been living apart for years. The fairy tale romance that once captivated millions was now just a distant memory. Behind his ever-polite, cheery public persona, Tiny Tim was profoundly lonely. He often spent long, solitary hours in his hotel rooms, clinging to rigid daily routines. He developed strange habits, including obsessively brushing his teeth, sometimes using multiple brands of toothpaste at once, seemingly trying to find comfort in small, familiar rituals. Just 2 months after his first collapse, on November 30th, 1996, Tiny Tim traveled to Minneapolis for a benefit concert at the Women's Club. Before the show, he confided in his wife, Susan, that he wasn't feeling well. He was weak, short of breath, and visibly pale. Worried, Susan begged him not to go on stage, but he refused. No matter how ill he felt, Tiny Tim was determined to keep his promise. He had made a commitment, and he wasn't about to let anyone down. In the end, he had given his life to music, and tragically, it was music that took it. By the mid-1990s, Tiny Tim's career had dwindled to small gigs, novelty appearances, and performances in obscure venues. Once a household name, he was now playing at state fairs, hotel lounges, and local benefits. Yet, despite his declining health and shrinking fame, he simply couldn't stop. Even as his body weakened, his devotion to the stage remained unshakable. Tiny Tim had been battling serious health issues for years. He suffered from diabetes, congestive heart failure, and severe dietary imbalances. Yet, despite his deteriorating condition, he clung to the belief that his unusual health rituals, such as consuming massive amounts of honey and avoiding cooked foods, would somehow keep him strong. He ignored repeated warnings from doctors, each urging him to slow down and take better care of himself. But Tiny Tim couldn't be swayed. His love for performing always outweighed his concern for his own survival. On September 28, 1996, he arrived at a small ukulele festival in Massachusetts. The crowd was modest, only about 135 people. But to Tiny Tim, it didn't matter. Whether he was playing for thousands or just a handful, he treated every show as a sacred duty to his fans. Doctors had been brutally clear with him. If you keep performing, you will die. But no warning could keep him from the stage. For most people, such a warning would have been a wake-up call, a reason to slow down and rethink their lifestyle. But for Tiny Tim, performing was his life. After decades on stage, he couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't singing, strumming his ukulele, and sharing his music with anyone willing to listen. His final moments were a testament to his unwavering devotion. Even as his health deteriorated, even as the world largely moved on from his peculiar brand of entertainment, he pressed on. Tiny Tim died doing the one thing he loved most, performing. His funeral was a modest affair, attended by family, close friends, and the last remaining group of devoted fans who still cherished his music. He was laid to rest at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis, the same city where he had taken his final bow, leaving behind a legacy as unforgettable and unconventional as the man himself. Despite the heartbreak of his final years, Tiny Tim left behind an indelible legacy. What was once seen as bizarre or comedic is now viewed with admiration. His devotion to preserving early 20th century music, once considered a novelty, is now recognized as a meaningful contribution to music history. His passion influenced future generations of performers, inspiring them to embrace forgotten genres and unconventional styles. In death, Tiny Tim finally earned the respect that had so often eluded him in life. His name was later immortalized on the iconic mural outside First Avenue in Minneapolis, a venue that only honors artists who have made a lasting impact on music culture. Tiny Tim's story was never one of traditional success. Instead, it was a testament to authenticity, to staying true to oneself in an industry that constantly demands conformity. His final moments on stage weren't just the end of a life. They were the closing act of a performer who never stopped believing in the magic of music. Thank you all, my dear friends. God bless you all. Those were Tiny Tim's final words before he collapsed, his last bow, given to a nearly empty room. Yet, he delivered it with the same heartfelt sincerity, as if the whole world were watching. His career had been strange, surreal, and often tragic, but in the end, he had lived and died on his own terms, with music in his heart until his final breath. And while his fame faded during his lifetime, interest in Tiny Tim never fully disappeared. In the 2000s, a treasure trove of his unreleased recordings was rediscovered, giving fans a new glimpse into his eccentric genius. Multiple biographies chronicled his remarkable life, introducing him to a new generation. In 2020, the documentary Tiny Tim, King for a Day explored his rise, fall, and enduring influence, sparking a renewed fascination with the man who dared to be different. Today, Tiny Tim's name is proudly displayed on the iconic mural outside First Avenue, the legendary nightclub in Minneapolis. This prestigious tribute is reserved only for musicians who have left a lasting mark on the venue's history. Though he is long gone, Tiny Tim's influence lives on, through his music, his unapologetically unique persona, and the unforgettable legacy he left behind. But was Tiny Tim's story simply a quirky chapter in Hollywood history, or is there more beneath the surface? Was he a misunderstood genius, a cautionary tale, or both? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more updates.